The phone rang in the night and my world stopped. My mother-in-law was crying on the line, voice breaking, telling me something I never expected to hear. She said she had seen things, heard things, and she begged me to listen. The words that followed were sharp and impossible, pointing at a person I trusted most. I stood alone in the kitchen, the clock ticking like a loud judge. If you stay with me, I will tell you what I learned and what I did. Please like the video and subscribe. This story is hard, but it matters. If you're watching from New York near the Statue of Liberty, listen closely. That night began like any other. I had finished my simple supper, put the dishes away, and sat with a cup of tea. The house was quiet in the way old houses are quiet. Every sound seems louder because there is so little else. The phone rang and I answered. My mother-in-law's voice was small and shaking. She said she had seen my son with someone else. She also said the woman she saw was someone who lived very close to me. The words came fast, breathless, and she kept crying. I had no time to make sense. Grief and fear moved in together, heavy and slow. I hung up and walked to the window, looking into the dark yard like an animal waiting for a shape to appear. I could not believe that my son could betray me. He had grown here, eaten at my table, slept under my roof. I had dressed his scraped knees as a child, washed his shirts, and sat up nights when he was sick. The idea that he might be unfaithful or dishonest felt like a physical blow. I tried to breathe. I tried to tell myself that the call could be wrong, that someone had made a mistake. But the tone in my mother-in-law's voice would not allow it. She sounded like someone who had seen a thing with her own eyes and could not unsee it. I went to his room. It seemed wrong to go at midnight, but something inside me moved like a slow tide, pulling me forward. The door was closed, the lamp low, and I pressed my ear against the wood for a long moment. No movement. The house was still. I left the door closed and walked back to the living room instead. Feeling the strong, foolish need to watch what I could not yet watch, I sat down and tried to make a small plan. Where do I begin when the ground underneath seems to have shifted? I thought of calling my daughter, but my hand hovered over the phone and dropped. I thought of knocking on his door, waking him, but I knew that confrontation in the dark would lead only to more broken things and words that could not be taken back. Instead, I went to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the little notebook where I kept addresses and numbers. I wrote down the time of the call and the exact words she had used. I wrote them like a witness writes, steady and true. Then I did the thing I never thought I would do. I went to the hall closet and took out my old camera. It is a simple thing, not new, but it works. I placed it where it would see the front door and the driveway, pointed it toward the road, and left it to record. I had no plan for what I might do with the images, but I knew that when nights are full of fear, proof can be a small light against dark. I turned the camera on and sat with the hum of the machine for a long time. Every car that drove by felt like something important. I watched the clock, fingers wrapped around my cup of cold tea. I would not sleep. I would wait. If the call was true, if the picture my mother-in-law had painted was clear and real, then I needed to see the pattern, the shape of the truth as it moved through the hours. Waiting felt like work. It felt like keeping watch. I told myself I would not act on feeling, only on fact. The night stretched. The house breathed. I waited, and the weight of what I might learn pressed down until the early gray light touched the window. When morning came, the quiet of the house made the night seem like a dream, but my hands still shook. I moved slowly through the rooms carrying a small plate of toast. The image of the woman my mother-in-law described sat in the corner of my mind, stubborn as a splinter. I found my son in the kitchen, pouring coffee. He looked older in the weak light, hair a little thinner on the top, a face I had known for 40 years. I watched him as if from a distance he smiled when he saw me, a practiced smile, quick and bright. He asked me if I had slept well. I told him about nothing at first, because to speak the truth would be to drop a stone into still water. He did not know, I thought. so I eased toward the subject with small questions. He answered lightly, then put down his cup and laughed small and very suddenly, a laugh that did not reach his eyes. The laugh made me feel strange. It made me think of lies told to hide a longer lie. I tried to read his face, to read the shift of it, the quick movement away from a thing trust has a way of making us blind, but the eyes remember what they have seen. I asked him casually about his plans for the day. He said he was busy at work and then would meet friends. His voice was careful, like a man who has practiced the right notes. When I said his name, plain and small, his smile tightened and he looked away. Something in the kitchen held its breath. I did not accuse. Then I set down my plate and asked instead about someone I had seen that morning at the end of the road, a passerby who looked like the woman his grandmother had named. He turned his head and gave a slow, cold smile. It was a smile that said many things without the use of words. The cold smile is the kind that says, in its own way, that the person knows more than the speaker. It suggests confidence, often the confidence of someone who thinks their secret is safe or their power secure. That smile hit me like a winter wind. I felt the old armor of mothering crack. Without raising my voice, I told him I had something to ask. I walked to him and laid a photograph on the table, a casual one I had found stuck behind a magazine the other day, the one he had shown me after a small dinner out. I watched his hand go still over the cup. He cleared his throat. He started to speak, but stopped. Words seemed to collect like children outside a closed door, waiting their turn. I asked again, slowly, whether there were things he had not told me. He laughed again, an edge now in it, and said, not to me, but to the air, that life is more complicated than it looks. I could see the way his jaw worked. That jaw had once leaned into scraped knees and school plays. Now it seemed to have found a new habit, to hold tight what others would open and share. I left the house that day as if for an ordinary errand, but my mind was a net, casting over the small things he left. The receipt on the counter, the card tucked in the book, the pairs of shoes under the bench. Each small item was a line to pull. I went to the place my son sometimes volunteered, a community hall, to speak with people who knew him in a role outside the family. I asked questions with the politeness of a neighbor and listened with the patience of a watcher. People smiled and told me nothing at first. Then one woman, a volunteer who had been close to my son in certain work, paused and said, quietly, that he seemed distracted lately, that phone calls sometimes came late and left him pale. She, too, had seen a woman near the market who matched the description my mother-in-law had given. I thanked her and walked away with a small, solid thing in my hand, confirmation that I was not imagining the shape of truth. Back at home, I sat long in the chair by the window, feeling the slow weight of changes settle like dust. I thought of how trust dies not in a blaze, but in small lost details, in the way a smile can change edges. The cold smile in the kitchen had not been mere arrogance. It had been a message that the world my son moved through could be private and guarded, and that I had been left outside that circle. It stung. But it also gave me a kind of clarity. Rage bubbled beneath the surface, a hot water that could scald if I let it. Instead, I cooled it down into planning. I wrote down where I had been, what I had seen, and what the woman's name might be. I kept my voice even and my hands steady. The confrontation would come later, but the first cracks had opened and I could see the path through them. We had been married more than 40 years. I remember the first small house we lived in, the single light in the kitchen and the noisy heater that kept our feet warm in winter. My son was born in that old house. I remember the first time I held him, the way his fingers curled around mine like vines. We built our life slowly, with patience and a kind of stubborn hope. For years I managed the bills and kept the family steady. My husband worked hard and sometimes left in the morning before the sun was up. We argued, we loved, we made the same jokes until they wore thin with comfort. Our son grew tall and stubborn, and then he grew into a man. I watched him learn to drive, to fall in love, to lose, to pick himself up again. I thought I knew the shape of him, the way a mother knows the curve of her child's foot, even in the dark. When my husband and I grew older, our roles shifted in small and steady ways. He retired and took to long walks in the mornings. I started going to the market more often and picking up small jobs to keep my hands busy. We shared coffee and the small newspaper in the mornings. Over time, there were changes I noticed but did not speak of. He began to spend more hours on the phone, and sometimes he would come home smelling faintly of perfume that was not mine. He was careful about it, as if secrecy were a delicate thing to be kept at the edge of ordinary life. I told myself that perhaps friends had reasons to be secret. Perhaps there were worries he did not want to burden me with. We had been through hardship before. I leaned into the assumption that love could hold everything. That assumption is dangerous because it hides the slow erosion of trust. I learned later that many small silences can add up to a gulf. Our son had long been the heart of our family. He was always the one to fix things, to clear the snow, to mow the lawn, to make the heavy lifts lighter. He was good with his hands and kind with his words. For years, I counted on his steadiness. When my mother-in-law called me that night, I thought of every time he had put his hand on my shoulder, every time he had stayed up with me through a bad night. Betrayal from children feels different than betrayal from a stranger. It cuts like frost. I had never imagined him in a position that could hurt me so deeply. How could a child of mine be the architect of such sharp pain? I dug through memories, seeing the late nights, the small excuses, the way he sometimes left the table quickly. In the quiet of the house after that call, those memories took on new, darker shapes. Looking back, I can see now how the small things pointed ahead. Perfume I did not recognize on his collar, receipts for dinners that I had not shared, the way his eyes briefly slid away when I tried to ask about his day. I had named some of it carelessness, some of it stress. That is what love does sometimes. It makes allowance for the uncomfortable truth I learned that grief is not always sudden. Sometimes it grows like mold in a bathroom, slow and quiet until you must tear the walls down to find the rot. My life had been built on labor and small acts of care. I had planned and saved and kept my son's life tidy in the ways of a practical mother. I thought I had done everything needed to keep our family whole. It is a hard lesson to learn that care cannot prevent every harm, and that trust must be shaped again and again, not assumed. Even so, when the evidence began to gather, I felt not only the cut of betrayal, but also a strange cold relief. Clarity replaces the fog of doubt and gives you something to act on. I resolved to move with care and purpose, not with the heat of a wound. This is how an older person learns to fight. With planning, with witnesses, with steady steps. I called my sister-in-law and a close friend and asked them to be with me as I looked deeper. I asked a small favor of a neighbor and borrowed a camera, and I wrote down every small detail. A life of caring teaches you to record things, to keep receipts, to save notes. Those small things became the tools I used when the quiet, late betrayal became a problem in my home. I did not want to lash out. I wanted to be sure. I wanted truth, and I wanted to protect the life I had spent trying to build. At first, the signs were tiny, like the whisper of a moth's wing. I would find a sock dropped in the hallway that did not fit any cat in the house. A pack of pills that had belonged to someone in the medicine cabinet would be out of place. He would leave the back door unlocked when he left for a walk, or I would find a note folded and tucked into the pages of a book. None of these things seemed large enough to raise the alarm. That is how deception begins in a long life. Through small shifts that a caring person might note and then forgive. I forgave because I had learned over years that marriage requires forgiveness for small failures. I forgave until forgiveness itself could not hold the weight of the pattern. There were quiet evenings when his phone lit up with messages and he would step outside to answer, speaking in a low voice. I would hear him laugh in a way I had not taught him to laugh, a different cadence. Once, after a dinner with neighbors, he came home smelling of a perfume I did not have. I asked him nothing, because the air between us had always been a place where unspoken things lived safely. The idea that this new perfume might belong to someone he saw in secret seemed absurd. Yet the oddness lodged like a small stone in my shoe, never comfortable, always present. Over months, these small stones made the walk heavier. I am an older woman who keeps lists. I write down things so I do not lose their details. When the list began to look like a map, dates, times, receipts, odd phrases in his mailbox, I realized the map pointed to a pattern not easily mended. I started making small changes. I did not confront him in anger. I took care to record rather than accuse. I set the camera in places I could not see from the chair where I sat, and I made sure to download the footage at midnight when the house would be still. Watching those small clips felt like looking through a keyhole at a life that was not mine anymore. The afternoon he left in a hurry and did not return until the small hours was the afternoon I decided I would no longer give my trust away without proof. I called an old friend who had worked in accounts and asked her to look over bank statements for me. She agreed without question. She had known our family for years, and she listened with the seriousness a long friendship brings. She found small transfers that looked normal on their own, but together formed a pattern of payment to an account I did not know. The money was not large at first, but monthly. It added up. After a while, there were direct transfers, and then a small line item that looked like a hotel charge near the address my mother-in-law had once mentioned. She told me plainly that money moves leave a trail, and a trail can be followed. The thought that I might follow it felt like reclaiming a small piece of dignity, like taking a hammer to a wall to find the rot beneath. I took care with each step. At my age, one must be careful not to create chaos that will harm the rest of the family. I asked for help quietly, kept the camera running, and made copies of receipts and notes. The slow erosion of trust taught me something hard. Patience in gathering evidence is not weakness, but wisdom. When the moment came to act, I wanted to have the pattern in my hand, the proof that was more powerful than any argument. This is how I prepared, by watching, recording, and building a case that even a lie could not swallow. Each small sign that had once been easy to forgive turned into a line on a map that showed me where the truth lived and where I would need to go to reclaim the life I had been given and the respect I deserved. The night I decided to stay awake, I prepared myself as one prepares for a small battle. I made a pot of tea and sat in the living room where I could see the hallway and the kitchen. I placed the camera tripod on the shelf and aimed it toward the door where shadows passed and shoes lined the mat. I told myself I would not move unless I had to. The house hummed in soft night sound, the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the small creak of the house settling. I felt like a child again, wide awake and afraid, but my fear was tempered by the steely calm of someone who has lived long enough to know that action is better than panic. Around midnight, the quiet shifted. The sound of steps, careful and slow, came from the hall. I watched the figure move in the dim light, a shadow that I knew by shape. My husband moved with a purpose that made my heart pull tight. He carried something small and wrapped. He walked toward the study and closed the door with a soft click that suggested secrecy. I waited until he had gone and then followed, keeping my shoes quiet on the rug. The small study smelled of old paper and lemon oil. I stood at the doorway and watched him open a drawer. His hands moved carefully, as if handling something fragile. He pulled out envelopes, photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. He placed them on the desk under the lamp and began to read, lips moving in a silent cadence. At first, I thought he was reading about work, but the way he held the photographs made my breath catch. He had taken pictures of my son from a distance, captured at moments when the young man was alone. There were receipts and notes with dates and names I did not know. The leather-bound journal seemed to have notes about places where my son had gone and times when he had been alone or vulnerable. A chill went through me. My husband sat back in the chair, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something in him I had not seen before, a kind of desperate fear that lives in the eyes of those who have been caught by their own lies. I did not confront him then. I stood in the doorway and let the room hold its own story. The camera on the shelf had already been running for hours and had captured everything without the clumsiness of human presence. I took 3 slow steps back, keeping my balance and my face calm. I closed the study door with the same soft click my husband had used and walked back to the living room. I sat as if I had been there all along, tea cooling in my cup. My heartbeat slowed, but my mind raced. Proof lay before me like a bright coin in the dark, and I knew I had to plan carefully. To move without evidence would be to risk being dismissed as a suspicious wife. To move with proof would be to put an end to the small thefts of trust that had been happening under the roof I had cleaned and loved for years. I called my niece, a clear-headed woman who had lived near and knew our family well. She came within the hour, and together we watched the footage I had saved that night. The images were quiet, ordinary in some ways, but the meaning carved itself into our minds. There was my husband, handling the evidence, the small ritual he had performed for months, a routine I had not known. We made copies of the photographs and the journal, and on a small table spread them out like evidence in a case. I felt strangely calm. Then discovery is a cold thing. It removes the haze and leaves a simple line between before and after. I thought of all the small signs I had seen and forgiven, and I felt a quiet resolve like a stone set in my chest. The night had shown me what had been hidden, and the next steps would be careful and firm. When I first read the journal entries my husband had kept, my hands trembled. The words were neat and precise, dated with small details of places and times. At first it looked like some old habit of note-taking, but as I read further, the pattern became visible and terrible in its clarity. He had been keeping track of my son in a way that was not comforting. He had noted when my son was at work late, when he visited the park alone, and when he met a friend for a coffee. The records were not observations made from a place of care. They read like a ledger of opportunity. There were notes about money, small transfers to accounts under names I did not recognize, and dates that matched nights when my son had been far from the house. Each page in the journal made a map of behavior that belonged to someone trying to control and profit from another's openness. As my niece and I sat with the pages, the truth revealed itself in dry, shocking terms. My husband had not only been watching and tracking my son, he had been funneling money in ways that suggested influence and pressure. There were notes about conversations he had claimed to forget, and times he had been seen in places he had said he had not gone. There were a few pages toward the back of the book that were worse, names of places where my son had been pressured to sign papers, references to counseling sessions that had been arranged but never mentioned to me, and a small list of accounts with transfers labeled in the kind of handwriting I knew well. My husband's a cold wash ran through me. The man I had trusted had been building a secret shape within our family, and my son had been trapped inside it without my knowledge. We called our family lawyer, quietly and with a steady voice. She arrived and sat with the papers spread out before her, turning pages with the professional calm of someone who has seen many lives come apart and has learned how to hold witness without flinching. She said the evidence was strong, notes, dated receipts, and the journal created a clear chain. "This is not small," she said, and I could hear the weight of the words. She advised us to copy everything, to secure the original, and to move carefully with the police and with formal documents. It is difficult to explain how a life changes when you find proof. You move from suspicion to action. You plan, like a farmer plans when frost threatens a crop. You do not act with heat, but with method. My son did not know the extent of what had been happening. When we sat him down carefully, with a neighbor and the lawyer in the room, his face went pale. He had suspected something, small and wrong, but not this. He let out a sound that I recognized as the thin noise of a man who had been surprised into old grief. He had been kept in the dark by the person who was supposed to protect him most. He had been treated like a commodity, with his life and the small savings he had managed treated as possible resources to be steered by someone else. The betrayal cut deep, but there was also a fierce clarity, the kind of clarity that lets you act without flinching. We took the evidence to the bank and to the police. We asked for accounts to be frozen and for official steps to be taken. It is never easy to move a family through such storms, but it is necessary. We found that my husband had done more than keep a journal. He had made arrangements quietly and over time to control certain accounts, to shift small sums that had once been discreet into places where they could be used without notice. He had convinced my son to sign a paper, a form that looked official, but that had given someone the ability to manage funds. The discovery left us with a heavy sorrow, not only for what had been taken, but for the way trust had been used as a tool of betray. When I first read the journal entries my husband had kept, my hands trembled. The words were neat and precise, dated with small details of places and times. At first, it looked like some old habit of note-taking, but as I read further, the pattern became visible and terrible in its clarity. He had been keeping track of my son in a way that was not comforting. He had noted when my son was at work late, when he visited the park alone, and when he met a friend for a coffee. The records were not observations made from a place of care. They read like a ledger of opportunity. There were notes about money, small transfers to accounts under names I did not recognize, and dates that matched nights when my son had been far from the house. Each page in the journal made a map of behavior that belonged to someone trying to control and profit from another's openness. As my niece and I sat with the pages, the truth revealed itself in dry, shocking terms. My husband had not only been watching and tracking my son, he had been funneling money in ways that suggested influence and pressure. There were notes about conversations he had claimed to forget, and times he had been seen in places he had said he had not gone. There were a few pages toward the back of the book that were worse. Names of places where my son had been pressured to sign papers. References to counseling sessions that had been arranged but never mentioned to me, and a small list of accounts with transfers labeled in the kind of handwriting I knew well. My husband's cold wash ran through me. The man I had trusted had been building a secret shape within our family, and my son had been trapped inside it without my knowledge. We called our family lawyer, quietly and with a steady voice. She arrived and sat with the papers spread out before her, turning pages with the professional calm of someone who has seen many lives come apart and has learned how to hold witness without flinching. She said the evidence was strong. Notes, dated receipts, and the journal created a clear chain. "This is not small," she said, and I could hear the weight of the words. She advised us to copy everything, to secure the original, and to move carefully with the police and with formal documents. It is difficult to explain how a life changes when you find proof. You move from suspicion to action. You plan, like a farmer plans when frost threatens a crop. You do not act with heat, but with method. My son did not know the extent of what had been happening. When we sat him down, carefully, with a neighbor and the lawyer in the room, his face went pale. He had suspected something, small and wrong, but not this. He let out a sound that I recognized as the thin noise of a man who had been surprised into old grief. He had been kept in the dark by the person who was supposed to protect him most. He had been treated like a commodity, with his life and the small savings he had managed treated as possible resources to be steered by someone else. The betrayal cut deep, but there was also a fierce clarity, the kind of clarity that lets you act without flinching. We took the evidence to the bank and to the police. We asked for accounts to be frozen and for official steps to be taken. It is never easy to move a family through such storms, but it is necessary. We found that my husband had done more than keep a journal. He had made arrangements, quietly and over time, to control certain accounts, to shift small sums that had once been discreet into places where they could be used without notice. He had convinced my son to sign a paper, a form that looked official, but that had given someone the ability to manage funds. The discovery left us with a heavy sorrow, not only for what had been taken, but for the way trust had been used as a tool of betray. Once we had the evidence, we did not act on emotion. We acted like people who had learned the hard lesson that anger without method can ruin as much as it repairs. I called my niece and our family lawyer, and together we developed a plan. First, we made sure the copies of everything were safe. The lawyer advised we take the copies to the bank and request an immediate freeze on any accounts that showed unauthorized transfers. We did this calmly, with the polite firmness required when dealing with institutions that move slowly. I signed papers and gave statements. The bank officers were sympathetic but careful. Systems require proof. I watched each pen stroke as if it were a stitch in the fabric of a new life I hoped to repair. Next, we contacted the local police and opened a formal complaint. The officer who took our case had a soft, steady way of listening that made me feel as if the small actions of an old woman might yet matter in a room of reports. He said we had enough to begin an inquiry and that there would be investigators who could follow the financial path. There was relief in the procedural steps. It felt like moving from a dark guessing game into a place where other people's authority could help. I remember thinking that at my age, it is good to see systems work, to see the machinery of law respond to a small family in pain. We also reached out to a counselor for my son, someone who had worked with families in similar situations. He arrived with a calm face and a notebook and sat with us as my son spoke in fits and starts. The man had been manipulated, my son said softly, and he had not known. He had signed forms because someone told him it was necessary, because someone who was his father had asked him, and because in that moment, his trust carried weight. The counselor helped us set boundaries and insisted that for the next weeks, we live with clarity and small truths. He gave my son tools for dealing with shame and advice on how to speak without anger when anger leads only to more pain. While these moves were in play, we had to think about immediate safety and the possibility of further deceit. My husband, when confronted, had grown quiet and then resentful. He tried to explain away the transfers as acts of protection or misinterpreted favors, but when the paper trail was placed in front of him and the bank and police began to ask real questions, his tone shifted into fear. Fear is a strong thing. It makes liars small and brittle. He started to make errors, calls traced to places, receipts with names that matched no one he had met. That is the curving truth of a lie. It grows until it is bigger than the liar can hide. In the background, neighbors noticed the subtle change and some offered help. One woman who had known the family for years brought over soup and a quiet hand on my shoulder. Small kindnesses like that matter more than speech when a life is being put back together. My niece and the lawyer became a steady line for me, people who could listen to the cautious talk and remind me of the small steps to take. We did not seek to destroy. We sought to heal and protect. The acts we took were not dramatic, but they were decisive. Bank holds, legal filings, counseling, and a careful, quiet presentation of truth in a way that could no longer be dismissed. Everything moved slowly, like the turning of a great wheel. Each step required patience and paperwork, but within a few weeks, the bank confirmed irregular activity, and the investigators opened a formal financial inquiry. The lawyer worked with us to draft restraining language around accounts and to take temporary control of finances to prevent further harm. These actions felt like reclaiming a house from a leak. First, you find the source, then you patch and repair. The repair is never perfect. Some stains remain, but the roof becomes safe again, and that safety allows a life to continue. In the end, the allies we gathered were what made the difference. A small family cannot fight everything alone, especially against someone who has made the management of money a private affair. Calling in the right people, friends who know the facts, a lawyer who can hold the path straight, a police force that follows leads, is not a sign of failure, but of prudent care. It is the same wisdom that taught me to keep a list, to save receipts, and to record small things. Those habits, once considered trivial, became the scaffolding on which I rebuilt my peace. When the evidence was in order and the professionals had advised us on next steps, we planned the confrontation with the quiet purpose of people who do not want to create a scene, but do want accountability. I asked my husband to sit with me in the living room at a time when the house was still and the light was soft. I did not shout. I laid out the items in front of him like simple facts, copies of the journal, photos, bank statements, and the recordings that showed his movements. I watched him as the color left his face. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he began a slow series of excuses, each thinner than the one before. He tried to say he had acted to protect the family, that he had been frightened and had made small mistakes. I listened with the firmness of a woman who had been patient long enough to know the need for proof. When words did not seem enough, the lawyer, who sat with us at my request, spoke plainly. She explained the legal consequences of his actions, the possibility of charges, and the steps necessary to restore what had been taken. She asked him to agree to certain actions, a full accounting, immediate return of funds or documentation showing where they had gone, and written admissions of the steps he had taken. An ultimatum is a heavy thing, and giving one is not done from a place of cruelty, but from necessity. I told him, in the same calm voice I had used to raise children and mend torn clothes, that we would pursue justice for what had been done. I offered him the chance to make things right quietly, with dignity. It was a narrow window. Either he cooperated, or we would go public with the full evidence. At first he tried to deflect, to play the small tricks of a man who has been practiced in avoiding responsibility. He spoke of misunderstandings and of times when money moved strangely because of the confusion of old records. Each explanation was a weaving attempt to distract from the facts. But when the lawyer outlined the documentation and the police confirmed they would investigate, his voice grew small. A man who had lived as the head of a family for decades began to look like someone who had been caught by the rope he had tied himself. The first time he handed over a single receipt was the first small crack. The second time he provided a blind account number that did not match any known owner. He started to tremble. The final moment came when he agreed to return control of key accounts to the lawyer, to allow for an audit, and to sign a temporary legal document to withdraw his access until the investigation concluded. It was not a triumph I celebrated with a party. It was a careful, human thing. A set of papers signed, a bank told to freeze transfers, a man set before the rule of law. The house felt different after that meeting. The air seemed cleaner, as if a window had been opened and stale hours were being cleared away. My son, who had been both bewildered and betrayed, sat with us and watched the events unfold like a child who had finally been given the key to a locked box. He was angry and ashamed, but also relieved that the truth was no longer hidden behind a wall. The weight of unspoken things lessened in the room. We did not seek to ruin a life for the sake of cruelty. We sought to stop harm and to retrieve the small things that allowed a family to function. Accounts to pay bills, savings to stand on, proof that a life was not merely the product of someone else's manipulation. The ultimatum had been harsh but necessary. People who betray the trust of a family often do so because they believe there will be no consequence. The important thing was to show that consequence. In the weeks that followed, some money was returned, some was contested, and the process of legal reconciliation began. The repair was neither instant nor painless, but the seams began to hold again. The weeks after the confrontation were a time of documents, bank visits, and slow, careful steps. The bank placed holds on the accounts and began the process of tracing transfers. The police investigator who had taken our case was thorough and patient. He interviewed clerks, called account managers, and followed the path of small transfers that had been hidden inside ordinary transactions. Each time they found a thread, they pulled and watched what unwound. The legal system moves slowly sometimes, but when a case has clear evidence, it can move as steadily as a tide. We learned to be patient and to let the process do its work. Patience is a skill that age teaches well. The consequence for my husband was not theatrical, but it was real. He faced hearings with bank officials, signed admissions to certain transfers, and agreed to a plan for restitution. In part, the lawyer arranged terms that kept immediate family needs protected while ensuring that there was oversight. Some money was returned. Some was not recoverable due to withdrawals and third-party transfers, but the accounting made it clear what had been taken and where responsibility lay. In the court of public record, the facts stood plain. The papers do not erase betrayal, but they do make it accountable. The hardest part was how the family changed in the small hours that followed. Strangers in our home, once intimate, had to be met with new boundaries. My son, who had always been a bridge between us, now had to step back and find his own footing. We had difficult conversations about trust and about what could be restored. It is wrong to think that money is the only harm in such a betrayal. The deeper wound is the reconfiguration of relationships. A child must sometimes learn that parents are fallible, and a spouse must adapt to the knowledge that someone trusted can be an agent of harm. These are the slow, human repairs that take time and care. As the legal steps progressed, the community began to know. Some neighbors were shocked, some saddened, some supportive. There is a particular loneliness in having your private family business become public, but there is also a relief in truth. People who matter will stand by you, and those who do not will move away. I found strength in small friendships, and in the routine of daily life, I returned to my garden, to the slow work of pruning roses, and found that tending things helps to steady the heart. The garden does not judge but answers with green and growth. The final documents signed and the bank's reconciliation left us with a sense of order returning. My husband, facing the consequences of his actions, moved into a different space, not a comfortable one. There was sorrow, and sometimes I wondered how a man I had known for decades could become a stranger. Yet the law had done what it could. It had made a record, put in place protections, and ensured there was oversight. It had also made possible the conditions for some kind of slow rebuilding. My son, who had been humiliated by deceit, began to find small ways to stand again. He found a job, small and steady, and began to contribute to the household in a way that brought new rhythm and dignity. In the end, the consequence was not only punishment, it was also the opportunity to ask the difficult questions and to build a new life on clearer ground. We took steps to change how we handled accounts, how we spoke about money, and how we protected one another. We set simple rules. All major financial moves would be made with 2 signatures, and records would be kept in a place everyone could inspect. This is not romantic justice. It is the practical work of rebuilding trust through transparency. The human cost remained. Nights when I woke and listened for old sounds, and afternoons when I found myself remembering the small ways my son used to laugh. But the heavy uncertainty had been lifted, and that allowed room for steady, small hopes. When the formal work of restitution and police reporting slowed, a longer, quieter chapter began. The house seemed to breathe differently, as if a weight had been removed even though the scars remained visible. I found myself making small rituals to mark the return of order, checking the mail together as a family each morning, setting the accounts on a schedule, and making sure that no important paper was left alone in a drawer. I learned that healing after betrayal is practical work. It requires routines and small acts that teach you to trust the world again in measured ways. Many people imagine revenge as sharp and triumphant, but the deeper victory is the reclaiming of ordinary days where one can sleep without fear and eat without counting small losses. There were evenings when sorrow returned like a tide. I would sit by the window and think of the life we had once planned. I had built a family with the pieces I had: thrift, patience, and quiet love. To see that work dented hurt more than anything else. But after the legal work was done, after the accounts were secured and the papers filed, I experienced an unexpected tenderness toward my son, and even, at moments, toward my husband as a broken man who had made terrible choices. Hatred is a heavy coat to carry. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, but lightens the load. I chose a kind of practical mercy. I would not seek to ruin a person simply for the sake of cruelty, but I would not ignore the need for justice either. The balance is hard. It is made of law and of quiet human limits. The family grew in odd new ways. My son learned to set boundaries and to hold his own money account with care. He called often and helped with small bills. He learned that dignity is not something given, but earned by living honestly. We had long talks about the difference between love and control and how sometimes those lines get blurred. I learned, too, to speak up earlier when small signs appear, and my son learned to listen. We found a steadying counselor who helped us translate anger into steps and grief into memory. We began to celebrate small things again: a fixed fence, a repaired roof, a new set of curtains. These acts were small victories, sutures that slowly mended the tear. People ask me now if I regret taking the steps I took. I answer without hesitation: no. The house needed a protector, and I chose to be that protector. I learned that age does not mean weakness. It means knowing how to use wisdom, patience, and careful action. The hardest part was watching a person I had loved step away from the life we had made. But I also learned that fidelity to truth is a fiercer love than blind loyalty. I do not mean to sound proud. I mean only to say that standing for what is right allowed us to rebuild a life that felt safer and truer. There are days when the memory of betrayal fades enough for me to laugh at a small joke or to bake a cake for a neighbor. Laughter returns as a slow thing, not a mask, but a part of renewed living. I keep a small box of notes my son wrote me during the difficult months, letters full of apology and promise. I keep them because they remind me that people can change and that remorse can lead to honest work. My husband is far from the life he once led, and the consequences of his choices shape him now. Whether that change will be full and deep is something only time will tell. As for me, I plant in the spring and prune in the autumn. Planting is an act of faith that the future is worth tending. The roses bloom, and I cut them back and feed the earth. I find comfort in the daily tasks of life. The house feels like a home again because we chose to make it so, step by step. If there is a lesson in this long story, it is this: do not let fear keep you quiet, and do not let shame keep you from action. Keep records, keep witnesses, and call for help when needed. Strength is not loud. It is steady and careful, and often very quiet. I tell you this not as a boast, but as a careful report from someone who has lived through pain and found a way to live again. If you are watching, know that small actions, saving receipts, keeping notes, speaking to a lawyer, matter. Trust your instincts, protect the people you love, and do the steady work of justice that keeps a family whole.